It's interesting sometimes how when you are canceled, how other people who are canceled become an ally because they realize how harmful cancellation can become. So one of the things is that a lot of people think that, oh, you know, all the people who are canceled are these right wingers or right. And if you look at
Not that they all.
if you actually look at it, it's like we are a very diverse group of people who are being treated this way.
Do skeletons have sex? In today's academy, is that a question that can even be asked? Today on Heterodox Out Loud, we'll be talking with the anthropologist Elizabeth Weiss. Elizabeth has some interesting views on this topic. Let's see what she has to say. Elizabeth Weiss, welcome to Heterodox Out Loud.
Thank you very much for having me.
So you're from California, and yet I think you hold the distinction of having traveled the shortest distance to come to the podcast studio. You're a visiting fellow in the Heterodox Academy's Segal Center for Academic Pluralism, and your office is right next door to the podcast studio.
That's actually correct. And even my apartment's not more than a 5-minute walk. So,
Well, so you walked probably 15 feet to come into the studio.
yes.
So anyway, thanks for making the trip today. Appreciate it. You're an anthropologist.
Yes.
Can you just tell us first, or where did you come from? How did you become interested in anthropology? What was the path that led you to the path that led you to this room this morning, this afternoon?
Sure. So I'm a physical anthropologist, which means that I study skeletal remains, or sometimes you'll also hear it referred to as an osteologist, so the study of bones, or bioarchaeologist, which is the study of skeletal remains in the archaeological record. And basically, from a from when I was a very young child already, I loved anatomy.
Like, well,
And
how old? How old?
probably around 5 or 6.
Wow.
So I loved anatomy. I always, had my parents get me those kits where you put together body parts like, the plastic model of the eye, or, skeletal models to put together the different parts of the body. And
Can I ask, were they encouraging you do they want you to be a doctor or something? Or was this actually coming from you? Or how do
I,
you
w-
see it now, looking
um,
back at
I
age
think
5?
it was very much coming from me. My mother has very similar interests. And my parents were very open to what we wanted to study, what we wanted to learn. Um, they were always very encouraging, and we made many, many trips to the library growing up. So that was another aspect of it. And so while I was growing up, I was also reading books, and during high school years, like Don Johansson's book about the discovery of Lucy, the 3.5 million year old early human ancestor. And I realized
And,
that,
and and this is the era, by the way, I think when I was in high school as well, perhaps, or maybe a little bit before you. But I remember books like Conrad Lorenz, The Nature of Human Aggression. Is that the
right?
right author and book? I
Yes,
can't
I
remember
think
now.
so.
And I remember reading things that were all being widely discussed about the gentle people, the Tacidae, and the Yanomamo. Are these things that were
Yes,
part of
yes.
is that part of the world
And
you were,
and that
or the early
absolutely.
the
So
early stew?
the Napoleon Chagnons, the Yanomami, the forest peoples, another one. So those are like the cultural anthropology aspects of anthropology that I really enjoyed. And also just books about medicine, like Oliver Sacks type books were very were of great interest to me. But when I got to college, I thought, should I do pre med? Maybe thinking about becoming a pathologist, so like doing autopsies. And I, or should I do something like anthropology that is really asking the big questions? How did we get here? What makes us different or similar to other animals? and how does anatomy play into that role? And so I really felt that anthropology married my love of the asking the big questions and possibly trying to answer them, and my love of anatomy, and especially skeletal anatomy. I think bones and skeletons, not only of humans but of other animals, are they're beautiful, and that's why we see so many, for example, artworks that incorporate skeletons. And it's just a perfect illustration of some of Darwin's evolutionary theory and how we are related and seeing the links, and just fascinated me. And so I once I took that step into physical anthropology, I never looked back, and continued on.
So you're an undergraduate. You decided to go to get a PhD in anthropology.
Yes,
And where did you go to your grad school?
I did my master's at Cal State Sacramento, which was a fabulous experience. It was 2 years master's, and I basically, did study on the limb bones of, a prehistoric California Native American, collection, looking at sex differences in the femur or the thigh bones. And then I went to a University of Arkansas in Fayetteville to do my PhD. And it was actually an interdisciplinary PhD with the geosciences, so geology and geography and anthropology. I also, in between there, I did 2 field schools. I went to Kenya to do, field school with Kubi 4 Field School, which was run by the, Leakey Foundation and Harvard at the time. And, then I did a field school in California as well through, Cabrillo Community College.
And so you were a professor at San Jose State, and we're going to come to that part of your story soon. Was that your first job, your first academic job?
Yes, it was. I mean, I did a postdoc at the Canadian Museum of Civilization, but it was
And
my first.
where is that?
That's in Ottawa.
Hmm.
So it's actually in Hull, which is right across
Hmm.
the river from Ottawa. Um, and I was able to do that because I collected most of my PhD data at that museum. And so then when I was finished and still looking for a job, I was offered the opportunity to stay on as a postdoc, and it was a purely research postdoc. So it was not teaching or anything like that, but just purely research. But then I, I was applying to various places to get a tenure track job, hopefully. And I saw San Jose State had a opening. I applied to it, and uh, what attracted me to San Jose State, besides it being in California, but also is that they, at that time, held the largest skeletal collection of a single site west of the Mississippi.
Wow.
So
Wow.
it was over 300 individuals of prehistoric California Amerindians. And I
And I'm sorry,
knew
by individuals, you mean skeletal
these
remains.
skeletal remains, yes. And so what I knew is that if I got this job, this was a resource that I could really build my career on, and which I did. I spent every semester, pretty much looking at those remains, curating the collection in a manner that helped preserve them. And one of the most fun things was bringing in student volunteers to help, seeing their excitement about studying the remains, but also, bringing in scholars, both graduate students and other professors from around the world to study these remains.
What year did you start at San Jose State as a professor?
2004.
Okay, so I'm just putting this on a timeline. And in 1990, there's the passing of the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, and we're going to get to that and talk about what role that played in your experiences. I'd like to talk a little bit more about anthropology, and just for a moment, dig in a little bit about the role of sex
Okay.
in the study of skeletal remains. So, can you just take us through a little bit about this? As I understand, um, sex has been considered an important analytical tool by anthropologists, especially I think archaeological anthropologists, for a long time. Can you just take us through some of the steps? I read around a little bit in advance of this
Sure.
interview, and I read about some things about the early attempts to determine sex were based on skeletal robusticity. What does that mean?
So basically, if we take a step back and talk a little, I'm going to break down anthropology into the four fields and
These are subfields now of the discipline.
subfields, right? So we have cultural anthropology that deals with living individuals and studying the cultures of those living individuals. And then linguistics that studies the languages of different peoples.
So linguistic anthropology
Called
might talk about how the languages are connected to one another.
correct, yes.
So in the back of a dictionary, you sometimes will find, Elizabeth was to look at dictionaries, you can find these maps showing linguistic patterns and
Right.
changes and
And they
branchings.
can be used to draw family trees, so to
Right.
speak, right? And then we have the two like more um so harder science anthropologies, you could say, the physical anthropology, which looks at skeletal remains, also fossils, mummies, things like that. And archaeology, which looks at the skeletal remains in the archaeological record, but also things we've left behind. So artifacts like things from arrowheads to mortars and pestles and so forth. And so I sometimes use the term bioarchaeology, which is a term that probably started around the 1980s that marries biological anthropology with archaeology because many biological anthropologists look at the remains of those in the archaeological record. And so in order to understand how past people lives were led, what their lives were like, we need to also understand who was doing what. Whether was there a sexual division of labor? Were males and females treated differently in terms of the access to resources they were getting? Um, was there infanticide? And if so, was that targeting female infants more than male infants and so forth? So all of these kind of questions to try to reconstruct what past people's lives were like n- requires oftentimes to answer the question about sex. And so early on, anthropologists were looking at how to determine whether someone had died was a male or female by looking at what we call robusticity. Robusticity means that the bones are kind of bigger, um, more rugged. So, like where a muscle attached is, which we call an entheses, it would be raised and rough. And then we have gracility, which is like smoother and smaller. And so one of the first things that was being done was looking at robusticity to determine males and females. But robusticity is not just based on sex, it's also based a bit on age. So when you have child's bones are very much more gracile. Um, but then it's also based a bit on size. So larger individuals will automatically have somewhat larger muscle markers or entheses. And there's some variation, population variation. But there's two other factors in there. One is actually activity patterns. What is sometimes people say like occupational stress markers. So you might have a big muscle marker because you were grinding acorns. But what anthropologists were seeing was that there was always the same pattern where males always look to have larger muscle markers than females, and this kind of clouded our ability to reconstruct the past. And so we had to start looking at, is there an independent way to determine sex? And then go back and look at the robusticity to see what is leading what.
And
You
this is
know,
and this is when people started studying pelvises more carefully.
pelvis was then the direction that would be going to look at something, a body part that wasn't affected by those muscle markers by robusticity. What we find is that as early as 1948, anthropologists started using the pelvis successfully to determine the difference between male and female. That was in Washburn published um, a study in 1948. But the big jump came with the Phoenix method in 1969 that uses just like literally a small portion of the area of the pelvis pubic region and looks at four traits. And with those four traits, if you're trained, and training doesn't take that long to identify the differences, you can tell the difference between a male and a female, 95% accuracy.
You can tell that even from having a fragment of a pelvis.
Yeah, so just a fragment of the pelvis, just a pubic section. So that would be the front section. But since that 1969 publication, we've found that sex differences really occur in almost every part of the body. And so anytime you want to try to determine what people were doing, you have to take into consideration the biological sex differences first. Because when we see patterns that cross cultures, it's likely something's biologically different between that group and this group, in this case, males and females. When we see things that are different from culture to culture, that's likely not biological. And so, one of the big things is when you're trying to figure out what people's lives were like, we don't just want to know what their biology was like. We also want to know what their daily lives were like and what their culture was like. And you need to kind of cut out the noise of biology to make the sound of culture rise.
Interesting. And just one more step on that methodological evolution in
Mhm.
terms of the importance of sex as a concept that could be useful in understanding how people lived together. The DNA testing is really important. That's the final step, I suppose.
Right,
The final step of
right,
chromosome 23.
right.
And tell
So,
us about that.
So probably in around the 1980s, late 80s, we started being able to use DNA to determine whether someone was likely a male or female. And they use either the dental enamel is one way. Sometimes they're not looking at the DNA directly, but at a protein that codes for that shows the differences between male and female. Um, and that's called proteomics. Um, and the other thing is you can find the DNA in a cut tooth, so like the inside of a tooth, and in some hard body parts like what we call the petrous after like petroglyph, right? Like rock, right behind your ear, the petrous area. So these are the best places to get ancient DNA. They're the best places to get DNA in the bone anyway, but the best places, especially that would preserve over long periods of time.
So the importance of DNA, looking at the teeth and different parts of the body to find the best specimens, the best places to look. Anthropologists care about the DNA for what reasons? There's sex is one of the reasons. Are there other
Absolutely.
reasons as well?
Diseases such as congenital diseases, such as and the extra Y or extra X chromosomes of sex disorders. Uh, you can also find the DNA of other parasites, like tuberculosis, in DNA testing,
So pathologies.
pathologies, and then the other one is relatedness. Who's related to who? So,
Interesting. Okay, good. So what we've done so far is you've shown that anthropology has a long history of wanting to learn some biological facts about the populations they're studying, looking for clues about that can help us explain how those people interacted and what their cultures were like. That there's some sort of linkage, an evidentiary linkage, we might say, clues at least, based on things like sex, for example. So sex is an important analytical tool. There's been different methodologies for determining what sex might be through the history of anthropology. DNA is kind of a breakthrough. Um, can you just say a word about how the importance of sex as an analytical tool in anthropology versus the importance of sex as an analytical tool in, say, forensics?
sure. So, one of the things is that anthropologists have basically led the way to identifying differences between sex in the skeletons, and that then spills over into forensics. And so when we learn about how to identify between a male and a female, And in a forensic setting, so if an anthropologist goes into forensics instead of archaeology, then what we basically have is that people learn that in part because of the anthropologist's work. So understanding the past helps us understand the present. Now, some people may say, why does it matter what happened in the past and they're not curious about past lives? But everybody should be concerned about identifying crime victims and solving crimes in a sense, because it's an applicable thing that has real life consequences in a way that something esoteric might not. And anthropologists have really been at the forefront of helping forensics identify difference between males and females, especially when those remains are fragmentary or just skeletalized. And now even the DNA research has come from a variety of different fields. But what anthropology brings to that table is looking for methods to identify a usable DNA when the conditions are far from perfect. So we have this uh, spillover from the past to the present when learning about sex differences, whether it's looking at bones or DNA. And DNA is a great, using DNA to determine sex is a great way to ensure that you're going to get the right answer. There can be contamination, of course, but it's a destructive method and it takes more time. So we should not be abandoning skeletal studies, the looking at it with our bare eyes to determine sex just because we also have DNA. We should be using all the tools in our toolbox to make those decisions.
Thank you. So, we've been talking about sex having an important analytical role in anthropology. I want to skip a little bit over to some issues that led to some problems for you at San Jose State. There'll be some issues with sex, as we'll come back to in a few moments. But so in 1990, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there's the passing of the Native American Grave and Repatriation Act. Tell us a bit about that. What was that?
So 1990, NAGPRA, Native Americans Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, was passed by President Bush. Um, and it was an act that was intended as a compromise between archaeologists and anthropologists and Native American tribes, where skeletal remains and certain artifacts like funerary objects or sacred objects would be um, given back to tribes who are affiliated with the past collection. Affiliation or the connection was intended to be determined using a variety of methods like um, historic documents. Um,
Let me be sure I understand. Just the broader cultural
mhm.
moment. So people are observing now, anthropologists going about their business, studying these human remains. We're now looking back at some of the authors I talked about before, Conrad Lorenz and some others, and we're thinking, well, a lot of these anthropologists were white European males entering into these cultures, viewing them as foreign, maybe not always being as respectful of them as they might be. That kind of mindset, that sort of moral awareness is now coming into as having us ask questions about how do we handle skeletal remains more respectfully, let's say. That's the context, right? Because
That's some of the
it
context,
wasn't only Bush who, a
right?
Republican the first George Bush, who was president when that act was passed. I understand it was also supported by numerous Christian groups or at
It-
least religious groups. So
yes,
there was a there was a moment around the passage of that act where people were trying to correct some insensitivity from the past. Would you say? How would you describe that?
I would say that
What was it intended to be?
I would say it was intended to basically correct some of those insensitivities. Some of those insensitivities did not exist and were um, there were a lot of exaggerations. For example, some of the anthropologists who were accused of not being sensitive actually had been working with tribes for decades, and the tribes were in favor of archaeology. So it was so it's that was part of the argument. I'm not sure that it wasn't greatly exaggerated. Another part of
Why would a tribe be interested in archaeology?
some people, well, I think that considering that we did not have a written record from any tribe prior to contact because written history didn't exist in the Americas at the time. Um, that this is a way for them to best understand their past.
Interesting.
And so one of the things
So
is
those native peoples would see anthropologists as allies in the project of understanding not
right.
just the general question about humanity, but the more specific questions about what happened to their people, what were they like, how did they live?
Yeah. And I actually get emails from Native Americans who say, "Yeah, I support your work as an anthropologist and are not in favor of reburial of skeletal remains." But I think the thing is, the other aspect of it was that there were some um, tribal activists who we can even call them repatriation activists, who really didn't want their myths to be negated. So they didn't want stories about coming over from a land bridge. We were always here. We don't need that myth to be propagated that we came from elsewhere. And so they were against archaeology from that perspective. And then there was some arguments about creation myths and challenging the Native American creation myth, which is where we get some of the overlap with Christian groups who were supportive the of the repatriation laws.
Can I just pause on what you're
Mhm.
saying? Because it's so fascinating. So, we're familiar with Scopes trials and other kinds of times, and earlier with straight up with the origin of the species of science unsettling people's settled worldviews or cultural views or religious views, and then being skeptical, in the Western people being skeptical of science and wanting to rein it in some way. And we're seeing something kind of similar. It sounds a bit like with some native peoples who have stories and understandings and deep cultural sets of beliefs and traditions that they now see science, anthropological science, as perhaps unsettling. Maybe we have not always been here. Maybe there's some story about our origins is not the one that we thought that we've been telling ourselves. So it's kind of interesting, isn't it, that both that
Yeah,
sort of Western thing that happened with Darwin
it is.
is happening now in another dimension with another set of cultures.
And several years ago, when NAGPRA turned, I think when NAGPRA turned 15, maybe when NAGPRA turned 20, I can't remember exactly. I did it
So we know that it turned
turned
30
30.
in 2020, which is gonna
Yeah,
be an important date for us in a
yes.
moment.
Um, I did a study that looked at all the reasons why people were for NAGPRA and repatriation and
Oh,
reburial.
interesting.
And so I just went through like every interview I could find and tried to ensure that I wasn't like duplicating the results. So like
Did you
try
publish that study?
I did. I've published it, in
I'd love to
Friends of the Past, I
oh,
believe is
I'd
the
love to read that.
yeah. And so what I found was that academics almost always cited respect as the reason for repatriation, and Native Americans almost always cited religion. So there was like
Interesting.
this like big divide between
Fascinating.
why uh, their perspective. But NAGPRA was a compromise because it was still allowed for the continued curation of collections that were not affiliated to any modern tribe. It allowed for the maintenance of artifacts that were not sacred or funerary objects. And it allowed for the continuation of use of teaching collections. And
Interesting.
so it was considered a compromise, but that compromise has been slowly eroded away.
I wanna talk to you about that exact issue now. So in 2020, very recently, you and 2 co-authors
One co-author.
oh, 1 co-author, forgive me, um, co-authored the book Repatriation and Erasing the Past.
Yes.
Tell us about that book. Tell us about how it was received. What
So
happened?
Jim Springer, who is a retired attorney and an anthropologist, he was trained as an anthropologist and then he went into law. he and I had been in contact for years about repatriation laws and about the problems behind them. We're concerned that these laws are changing in ways that that um, makes the delicate compromise no longer a compromise. For example, um, they've now removed the concept of unaffiliated, so everything is supposedly identifiable to some modern tribe. And there's also issues about the separation of church and state because how the law is written, it requires that two committee members are Native American traditional religious leaders. So one of the aspects um, of the separation of church and state is that the state is not supposed to favor any religions, right? That's the establishment clause. And so it's not that you can't have a religious leader in a committee, but you're not supposed to say what religion, right? And so that's why it's this violation. And we decided that we would write a book together on the topic. He had written on the topic before. I had written on the topic before. And one of my first articles was Kennewick Man's Funeral, published in 2001. So, um, so we
And I'm
just
sorry, you decided to get involved in this book because you were already concerned that NAGPRA was being used in some ways that were not intended, or at least were deleterious to science in
I
unnecessary ways.
I
Maybe
thought
they were illegal.
I thought that NAGPRA was that the balance that they had struck was not going to work, and that there'd be kind of like you give an inch and then another inch and another inch, and it's going to creep into um, the a way that will take all the collections away. And one of the
So the compromise between, let's say, respect or whatever term we're going to put on that side, and the needs of science to investigate and learn and help develop our understanding, that compromise in the original act was kind of being eroded in one direction more and
right,
more steadily.
yeah,
And we can just say, just as a background, there, as we follow at HXA intricately, with intricate detail, there were cultural changes affecting the universities, in fact, sometimes coming from the universities,
yes,
that were consonant with and perhaps accelerating those trends in one direction and not the other.
yes,
So, sort of scaling back about the claims, of the weight that we give the claims of science and investigation starts becoming impinged upon and reduced because of the weight that's being given to concerns about respect
yeah,
or
and one of the
identity, you could say.
and so when Jim and I decided to write this book, it was like maybe 2016 or 2017, and we thought we have to start it so that we aim it to come out 2020, 30 years of NAGPRA. And we put together a proposal. We submitted it to University of Florida Press. It went under peer review. The proposal did, and then the book did, and it was accepted. And it came out, I believe, in September 2020 or October 2020. And I had basically thought, oh, it's just a little academic book, price too high, not not many people will read it. Um, and I had kind of, thought I did what I said I was going to do. I think it's an important book. I think we lay out some very important details about how NAGPRA has gone wrong, about the legal aspects, which Jim did an excellent job highlighting the problems of the unconstitutionality of NAGPRA. And so I thought it was an important book in that sense, but I did not think that it was going to necessarily have the effect that I thought it should have. Um, and what ended up happening was right before Christmas, I get a email from my publisher saying that they're in crisis mode because there's a Twitter campaign um, that is brewing, trying to pull down the book. Basically, they're calling for the book to be retracted.
And
There was
is this campaign coming from anthropologists? Is he coming from native peoples
It is
is he
coming
coming from college undergrads here and
It's
there?
mainly coming from anthropologists, from anything from, I think mostly professors or lecturers, right? So, and
Let me just freeze at that moment if we can.
Mhm.
So professors now who have an interest, the professors of anthropology, let's say, who have an interest in some of these analytical tools you've been talking about, insofar as they care about learning about how past cultures lived and changed and developed, they're the ones who are importantly concerned about your book.
Yes, they definitely were.
What's motivating them now? So we would think, as anthropologists who care about the truth and the study of knowledge, we would think that they would be perhaps allies, or at least would want to find some appropriate balance. But
Yeah.
that's not what's
It
happening.
it was quite interesting because, and almost 1,000 people signed the open letter that called for the book to be pulled from libraries.
So they want to censor your
They wanted
book.
to censor it. They
So
they
just to be sure I get it, just make it really explicit for our audience. So here we're seeing now in 2020, 2021,
2020, 2021, yeah. Yeah,
just as it
yeah.
comes out, we're seeing a mass call for censorship
Yes,
of a book by by two anthropologists, by other anthropologists.
yes. And worldwide. So it wasn't only Americans, it was worldwide. And so basically, they were saying the book was harmful to Indigenous people, anti-Indigenous, which I would say it was not. Of course, I would say that. But the reason why I would say it's not is even if they disagree with me, it's not like we were saying, "Oh, like, name calling, we're not derogatory, we're" it's more like, this is the science, and so the book is split into 3 sections, basically a section on what you can learn from skeletal remains, this middle section, the legal aspect of NAGPRA, and then the last section is how NAGPRA has shaped the field, including, s increasing censorship because people don't want to upset, um, tribes who
So,
might
so,
have who might be the ones granting access, for example.
so there can be self censorship on the part of
Yeah.
scholars now.
Yeah, and, and we argued that we really need to move away from what we call a repatriation ideology, which we define as a postmodern ideology that is built around the kind of narrative of there's the oppressed and the oppressor. The oppressors are anthropologists who want to study the remains. The oppressed are the Native American spokespeople, um, and we need to move towards um, objective knowledge. And so one of the things we call for is not to use things like creation myths, superstitions to make claims about the past or make repatriation claims. That if those claims are to be made, they should be made based on evidence. That's not to say that people can't believe those things. And you know, I think, but it's different to say, you know, my belief is going to determine what the truth is.
It would be similar, to go back to an analogy we were running before, to people who said that Darwin's texts should not be read or should be
Right.
removed from libraries. I'm not saying your book is
Sure.
like Origin of
Obviously.
Species, but it's again, it's on the same side of people who saying that make your case with evidence doesn't always apply. That
Right.
idea of make your case with evidence and apply disciplinary standards and disciplinary tools, that's going to be now taking second seat to questions about identity and politics, following the narrative oppressed versus oppressor.
And so one of the things in the open letter and a lot of the other different steps that people took to try to get my book pulled is that they kept on um, referring to things like the book is anti-indigenous or racist. Um, and I noticed that many of these criticisms were coming from what I would call the tribes of anthropology. For example, the Black Trowel movement, which is a student and early professor group that considers themselves kind of Marxists. Then there's the Queer Archaeology Interest Group. There's the Trans Doe Task Force. So all these different like kind of tribelets were kind of calling for the book. And then also my presentation at the Society for American Archaeology to be pulled and for me to be basically banned from the field.
I want to talk about that panel. But first, let me be sure I just want on what you were saying a moment ago. So these are people now in the field of anthropology, graduate students, many of them. And at HXA, our studies can show fairly consistently that of the various populations in the academic world, graduate students tend statistically to be the ones most likely to support cancellations and shout downs and even things like that. Um, and now these tribes, tribelets, you once you called them a moment ago, but these are people who are anthropologists.
Yes.
And anthropology as a discipline, I think we started off by saying that is interested in discovering and teaching us more about how cultures lived in the past. Do these new tribelets, these new groups, not see that as the purpose of
I
of anthropology?
I don't think they do.
Do they
And
reject? Do they call themselves the new anthropologists, and this is how anthropology should be done,
I
or is it a purely negative program against some of those
I
evidentiary ambitions to just know in a scientific way?
I think it's a little bit of both, but I think what they do is they have an anti-West or anti-Western science when we know there's no such thing as Western science. Science is science, right? But um, and a anti-colonial decolonization platform. But the other thing, what they do is, I think that they put their personality and traits and identity politics onto the past in a form of presentism. So if they are trans, then they're looking for trans in ancient Romans, right? As opposed to letting the data speak to them, they're speaking for the data. Is what I think that that's a big part of it, and I part of this is that it's political, you know, identity politics narrative, and if that is what I did not see coming. In a sense, I thought that my book was much more narrowly focused on the problem of repatriation, and I didn't see it spinning out into these other problems. And now, as I, look back, it's been 4 years. I think, wow, how did I not see that coming? It's also interrelated. And I'll give you a really good example of how it's interrelated. When one of the things that my university did when they decided to change the protocols and lock me out of the skeletal collection is they added a menstrual taboo that if and in their menstrual taboo in the protocols they said menstruating personnel, not women, but menstruating personnel, because of course they don't want to use the word woman, um, cannot go into the curation facility, cannot hold the skeletal remains. Well, that showed me that there was like this the anti-sex is binary group and the pro-repatriation group had become intersectional. And so I think that these kind of things are much more intertwined than I had ever expected.
And so that intersectional moment, or you might even say intersectional tip of a spear,
Mhm.
to make it a little military, brings us to what happened to you at San Jose State when you were shown holding a photograph of a skeletal remain, not wearing gloves, I believe, and the
Yeah,
picture that caused the problems. This is a picture that is you can tell the story of what happened with you,
sure.
but just I think it began with this picture being a very similar picture of you being shown proudly by your
Yeah,
university because of your excellence as a scholar.
yeah.
So tell us a bit about that photograph and what was that about?
So, of course, everybody was, not on campus for months at a time because of COVID, and the reaction to COVID. And so I had right before COVID, literally like right before the university closed, I was in the curation facility, taking care of skeletal remains, doing some work. And then COVID hit and we were all, sent away. And when we finally got back after 9 months or something like that, I was so happy to be back in this curation facility, and I was, retaking care of some of those remains
Back among your bones.
back among my bones.
And
And
again, I just wanted to say, and as you said very eloquently before, one of the excitements for you by going to San José State was that it had these bones.
yes,
So you could work on these skeletons.
and so I
Now you're
was
back. You're
I'm
back.
back, I'm taking care of them. I open a box in order to put something else in, and I see this beautiful skull. It's a skull of a child, and I, recognize it as one of the individuals that I've seen many times. And I held it up and I took a photo. Um, and I was just and I tweeted it, so happy to be back with old friends.
So
And
COVID's over. Now you're back.
COVID's
You're
over,
back. You can start doing
and
your work.
the there's just a Twitter storm. And it was kind of interesting because right before that, I also published an op-ed criticizing California's new repatriation law that says that you must give deference to tribal narratives and that it's no longer a balance, that if there's a scientist's perspective and a tribal perspective, you have to give deference to the tribes. So
This is a state of California law,
California, yeah.
and it governs university research,
Universities,
but also museums.
museums, yeah. And so I had written an op-ed that got in the newspaper, and I posted that on Twitter, and then the photo, and very close to each other in time wise. But it was a photo that seemed to have caused the most upset. And now this,
I'm sorry. I just need to say this because we work together a lot here at HX, you and I, and you have this gentle way of doing sort of badass things. So you you put the picture up there, and you put an op-ed taking a position that people are going to be objecting to in a strong
yes,
way, but you do it anyway.
yeah,
And I'm going to guess you did in your what I always see from you, with this very quiet but intense, principled
well,
way you seem to navigate the world
yeah.
and your profession.
And and I thought, oh, people will be upset about the op-ed, but I did not see it coming for the photo, because in at that time, 17 years or so at San Jose, the number of times I had been asked to pose with skeletal remains was numerous, for the websites, for promotional things, before talks, even right before COVID. I had a picture of me, this very similar photo, um, and nobody had ever said, "Oh no, that's not right." And
Very similar photo. You mean a photo of you
holding a skull,
holding a skull,
smiling,
a skull,
yes, smiling, no gloves, right?
no
And
gloves.
and it's a common photo you see an anthropologist take. And so, you know, the provost wrote a letter to the whole campus-wide community and saying that this photo um, was disgusting and um, didn't show San Jose values. And I had actually reached out to him and said, I'm happy to talk to you about this and the actual situation and why you know, this photo is now causing problems, because I really do believe that the problems were caused by the op-ed and then the photo, as opposed to had had I been pro repatriation and done the same photo, I'm not sure that anybody would have minded. Um, and he decided not to meet with me. But he did send out the letter I had written in response to it, um, to the same community of people, and I did appreciate that he did that. But it it goes to show how, like, you can do the same thing from day 1 to day 2, and the day before it was perfectly okay, nobody would have said anything, and the next day, because of your perspective, they attack that act. Um, the whole issue of gloves was, is an absurdity that I'll never understand. Anthropologists sometimes use gloves. Forensic anthropologists use them more than other anthropologists because, if it's a crime scene, you don't want to contaminate the crime scene. Perfectly makes sense. Sometimes anthropologists will use gloves in old collections that have been treated with arsenic, like old mummies are sometimes full of arsenic. So, yes, you want to use gloves then, right? But for the most part, when you're dealing with skeletal remains, especially remains that have been excavated 50, 60 years ago, handled by dozens of people, you don't use gloves because if you're holding the remains with gloves, you're more likely to drop them. And even like the National Park Service, which is part of the government that NAGPRA falls under, says you shouldn't use gloves. So, they say, if all else is equal, don't use gloves. So there was nothing wrong with not using gloves. But it seems like there's this kind of, "Oh, well, her bare, dirty hands."
Yes, yes.
It's a moral issue, not a technical issue to them.
So the storm starts building,
Yes,
and I know there are lots of pieces of this story that we could
right.
talk about for hours. But can you just tell us in a condensed way what happened then? So you're a professor. You're now suddenly in the midst of a storm. But your profession, a lot of your professional colleagues are running against you in some
Yes.
ways. What happens to your position at San Jose State?
Basically, they tried to take away my curation responsibilities. My chair had said to a group of deans at a webinar conference that he would try to keep resources away from me. Um, if I assigned my book, he would want to take me out of the classroom. Um,
If you assigned your book to your
to
students,
my students,
that would be again something you'd want to
yes.
censor and prevent.
Um, I had reached out every single step of the way. I first reached out to the people involved. I said, I'd really like you to withdraw that statement. Not you have to say you agree with me, not that but that you're planning to keep resources away from me, that you're planning to take me out of the classroom. Things that were concrete things that I was like, if not, I'm gonna have to take action. And
And
so
Elizabeth, again, you're wanting to open up conversations
right,
about an act and the direction and the way it become to be interpreted. And that's what is being objected to. You're opening up the
right,
conversation, and you're committed to doing it using evidentiary standards of the discipline and of the field. You're not
yes,
doing any sort of hocus pocus or anything. You're just you're asking to do science in a way that's open to conversations about normative issues that might constrain scientists in some
yeah.
way.
And the other thing is, I have never said like, "Oh, people shouldn't be for the reburial of bones." I'm not, but it's not. I I just I've worked with people who are very pro repatriation and never had an issue, and so
You're not for the reburial of bones anytime?
anytime, um, um, I think that you could draw the line at saying like family, like person you knew that is, and it's interesting in our own culture, we don't always bury bones, right? Some people donate it to science, some people decide cremation, some people decide burial. I mean, so it's not that outrageous to say, well, I do think that the body should be used after death, and organ donations is another example. So 50 years ago, people might be, or 100 years ago, people might think, "Oh, that's terrible to donate your organs. Everybody should be buried intact." And now we have a discussion about, organ donations, right?
Let
So
me
I
be
do
sure I understand that. So in those cases, people are making decisions about their own remains after they
sometimes,
pass.
but sometimes those decisions are made by family members,
Okay,
right?
good. Now let's get more
And then
complicated, or by
right?
tribal groups who
And
speak for them.
sometimes by other groups, sometimes, so it just depends. But let's say, for example, um, let's say my mother would die, and my mother she's already told me that she wants to donate her body to science. But let's say my father would want to have her buried, and I would say, "No, I know she told me that she wants to donate her body to science." I'm actually more closely related to her biologically than my father, who's not hopefully not related to her biologically, but he gets the final say so as a spouse. So there are these kind of nuances, and
Right.
so I say, I'm not for the burial of bones. I do understand that there are nuances and therefore we can have a compromise, but that compromise needs to be very narrow and very clear cut. And I do think that that's what NAGPRA tried to do, but it has fallen apart now. But I would never tell somebody, "Oh, this book about that's in favor of repatriation should be taken off the shelves."
Right.
And when I taught the topic in my classes, I always assigned something that I had written, um, and somebody who completely disagreed with me.
Good for
And
you.
I
Good for
never
you.
graded students on whether they disagreed or agreed with me because that's not a gradable topic. It's more like we had the discussion, and I graded them on whether they knew what a femur is or not, right?
Right.
So
Right. And you no longer will be working at San Jose State in the very near future, I think, officially.
that's correct.
How did that come to be?
I'm gonna retire at the end of next month. So I sued my university. The first round,
They were denying you access to
they
the
were denying
remains.
me
They were making
access to
claims about
remains,
not teaching your own book in your own
right?
class.
They were also
Even in an open-minded way, that was not enough for
Yes, they
them.
were also keeping me away from materials that were not Native American, like the Carthage collection, which is a skeletal collection from Tunisia. And they were trying to keep away resources from me. They were also trying to put a ban on all photography of skeletal remains, and much of my research requires photography. And so I basically sued the university.
So they hadn't fired you from your
No,
job, but they
I
were removing, the research and teaching, privileges,
yeah,
let's call them privileges together
yeah,
for fun maybe. They're removing those teaching prerogatives in a way that made it very difficult for you to continue being an anthropologist at that
yes.
university.
And so I was never taken out of the classroom, I think, because I filed before they did that. I fought against every change. So I um I spent 10 months fighting for the Carthage collection and finally got it.
Having access to those
Yes.
remains.
I fought against the um photo ban, and I they uh that did not pass. I also um
I'm sorry, but there are widespread photo bans now, right, in anthropology.
yes,
A lot
and
of
then
remains.
yes,
This is sweeping the whole field, I
right,
believe.
right. But
So
at
and then
that
again,
time,
just for our listeners, the idea is that, photographs of skeletal remains also now fall within the sweep of this ruling, this act, and are considered should be removed from
right.
study and removed from textbooks.
And even and some journals don't allow photos anymore. There's been a real attack against photography, but not only photography, X-rays, data, and this is part of that erosion of NAGPRA, where they're trying to redefine human remains to include things like that.
Interesting.
Um,
Interesting.
the last set of rules have not done that, but they are right on the edge of that, and many museums have taken it upon themselves to put in photo bans.
Was your decision to retire part of an agreement for the settlement?
It was, um, I if I had not retired, I could have gone on. I mean, like, there I don't think they would have fired me. Um, the last ruling was, in my favor in the sense that the first ruling was a order to dismiss my case, which the judge allowed with an amendment, and the requirement was that I take off everything in my case that revolves around Native Americans because you cannot sue Native Americans, but they must be a party to the suit. So kind of catching me in a catch-22. But then we went back with everything like that stripped out, and we were able to move forward. But at that point, I was like, what am I going to get from the suit? And I realized that it was nothing I wanted. um, and so I settled. And what the settlement allowed me to do,
I've heard you describe the settlement as a victory.
I do think it was a victory. I think it was a victory because I never apologized. The settlement did not require me to apologize, to take anything back, to um, to issue any statement of um, incorrect doing, anything. And I don't have anything to apologize for. But it's also a victory because I was never taken out of the classroom. I did succeed in overturning that order to dismiss. I did get the menstrual taboo taken off of the protocols. I was able to get um, access to Carthage. So it it was a settlement that I do think that the university was happy to do as well. So I don't think it was like, oh, I won and they lost. I think it actually both sides ca- came away with things that they wanted. I'm still emeritus. I will be an emeritus professor, so I'll keep my title. I'll keep my connection to the university in that way. But the other thing is, um, you know, without having access to the large skeletal collection of the Native American remains, there was just no reason for me to be in San Jose because I felt like that was such a big part of my job.
Mhm.
And finally, the other thing is, you know, I was able to come here, which
Well, let
I
me
wouldn't have been necessarily able to do had I continued with the law.
let's talk a bit about that. So you're one of our visiting fellows in the first cohort of visiting fellows here in the Segal Center for Academic Pluralism. When you arrived in August or
Yes,
September?
in August.
So, you arrived, and of course, we were delighted to have you because of who you are and the kind of work you've done, and if I may just say, the exemplary way, in my view, in which you are so principled on these positions about open inquiry. But you do it in a way with a kind of a gracefulness that's just really remarkable, which doesn't make you bend in any way. You don't bend. You're like one of the most principled people who I know, and yet you do that in a way that is accord with the HXA way, making your case with evidence, leading by example, showing what a better way is. Doesn't mean that everything will come out our way when we proceed this way, but there's power in that, I think, in the longer run. But you had barely arrived here with us when another controversy started whirling up, and it goes back now to some of the things we talked about the importance, the long history of sex being an important analytical tool in anthropology. And so, and again, just sort of briefly, if you would, you and some colleagues proposed a panel about the analytical importance of sex, the enduring analytical importance of sex in anthropology, for the American Anthropological Association. Was co-meeting with CASCA, with the Canadian Anthropological
Society.
Society of,
It's just Canadian,
okay, Canada.
and then Canadian Anthropological Society, and then the other part of that acronym is it in French.
Okay, okay. And the conference was to be held in Canada in November, I
Correct.
think. And just briefly, what happened?
So basically, Kathleen Lowry, who is a cultural anthropologist, she and I have been in communication about the issue with about sex and the issue of sex being binary. That means it's male and or female. It's not on the spectrum. And so,
And there can be exceptions on margin, but the broad
yeah,
categories are
the
male versus female.
sex is binary. I would say that gender is bimodal, where it's almost all male or female, woman or man, but there are a few exceptions. Um, Gender is the expression of sex. So, like, you'll have cultural expression of sex, but it does. So it's not biological. From and this would be like the definition of an Anthro 101, right? That would be like the classical. So a lot of people
Sorry,
confound sex and gender.
right.
But
And not just anthro, but other disciplines typically define sex and gender, and they use different terminology,
right.
but it's the same structure.
So we actually proposed and it was Kathleen's idea, a panel called
Let's talk about
Let's
sex,
talk
baby.
about sex, baby, right? Why sex is an important analytical category in anthropology. And and we talked about, it was about
And it
sex
was
being binary,
and it was an all-women
all
panel,
women panel,
some of whom were very well-known, very strong feminists,
some of them very
including
strong
one, I
feminists.
think, feminist separatist, as I
Yes,
remember. But
yes.
go on, tell us
And
more.
so, like, in some ways, these women, um, um, and I were likely to have had disagreements amongst each other about all sorts of things, but we agreed that sex is binary and that that's important to keep in anthropology. Um, and
Or
so,
can I try to say it a little more precisely? You all agreed that sex is an important analytical
cool.
concept or tool
Yes, and that
in
it is binary.
and that it is binary in the field of anthropology.
Yes, and um, so we put together a panel, submitted our abstracts, everything. We got our, congratulations letter in June. Heard
Because it had passed a kind of peer
a peer
review, the
review,
usual
yes,
thing. Now, you can't just send any panel, and a panel has to be selected out of all the applications they get
right,
as being worthy, in terms of knowledge production in this
yeah.
field at this time.
And then I think it was October, so about a month before the actual conference, maybe it was late September, but that time, I was already here. Um, we get a letter from the two presidents, the American Anthropological Association and the Canadian Anthropology Society, saying that they're retracting the our acceptance first time in their 122-year history. And because we were putting forth the panel in a way that was harmful to the LGBTQIA community and anthropologists in general. They argued that sex is on a spectrum. I would say that sex is not on the spectrum. And they also, I would say, nitpicked that I used the term sex identification instead of sex estimation in my abstract. Had they come back to me and said, look, most people now talk about estimation and not identification, I would have changed that. That was not, it wouldn't have changed my argument. I was, but
But
I,
estimation suggests that the best scientific tools we have do not allow us to identify what the sex
right,
is.
right.
But
And
sex
so,
identification would say that the best tools we have do allow us to identify.
yeah,
So estimation is a much weaker
it is.
concept.
I would say that, even if we're not 100% right with our sex identification, oftentimes the reason why we're wrong is not be is in part, we don't have the perfect tools, but the other thing is skeletons are not always perfectly preserved, right? And,
But taking that estimation, that little shift, which is a small thing,
yeah,
but that little shift, though, sounds really important to me because if you follow the same logic, any scientific claim in anthropology and elsewhere should always be described as an estimation,
right. Yeah, and
no
that's
matter what it is.
exactly,
And that uncertainty is not the way science works, so we can't make progress with that.
like, I would say
It's not honest, in
it
fact.
it's I would say you estimate age, but
Right.
that we're good enough at sex identification that we identify sex. And but they didn't reach out to me about that.
But I'm
They
sorry,
basically just
but forgive me,
canceled it.
but it seems like an attack on the very concept of identification. An
Yes, it
attack
is.
which is an attack on the idea of knowledge, being able to track things in the world. It sort of pushes back on a point that has some moral allies behind it to weaken that principle, the principle that
Yes.
we can know some things.
I think that that's why they want estimate, because their thing is like, "You never can know. There's no real truth there." And this is one of the, you know, uh, one of those anti-science ideology movements in my mind.
Which is an example about a moment in this very technical field and this panel you're on, an anthropologist out there, among many other things going on in the academy that month. It became a focal point of a culture war to some degree, with one side piling on and you're
Yes,
and you and a few of us here sort of standing up against it. But they canceled the panel.
they canceled the panel. Um, and um, thanks to Heterodox, we had it anyway online.
We
Um,
uncanceled it.
we uncanceled it. And it got like worldwide attention.
Right.
And I think that
And it was, if I may say, I was privileged to be on that panel as a discussion as the moderator. It was a great conversation.
yeah,
Those women were fabulous.
I really wish that that it could have been done in person because I want to meet all of these women in person, and I haven't done
And it
yet.
was clear that you had very different views on so many interesting
Right.
topics. And, there were some strongly held views being expressed on that panel. And there was a combat of ideas. And yet all of you were in this position of having been pushed out of the professional norms because you didn't accept the idea that you have to back off from truth claims.
Yeah. And it and it's interesting sometimes how when you are canceled, how other people who are canceled might never have been your ally become an ally because they realize how harmful cancellation can become. So one of the things is that a lot of people think that, oh, you know, all the people who are canceled are these right wingers or right, and if you look at
Not that panel.
if you actually look at it, it's like we are a very diverse group of people who are being treated this way, whether it's about sex, in anthropology, whether it's about repatriation, whether it's about some of the other issues surrounding identity politics, or even topics that seem like why why would somebody be canceled about that when it comes to certain aspects of um, issues about um, AI or things like that.
We follow those patterns pretty closely, and it suggests to me that there is a deeper level of conflict going on. There's a battle over deeper concepts like the battle over um, a science and knowledge, or not knowing, being hesitant about our claims or being stronger in our claims. Those are the underlying conceptions about, do we know anything? Is it all up for grabs? Are there truths? Those are the things that,
Yeah.
just oddly enough, because these are very abstract concepts, but those are what animates a lot of these cancellation attempts.
Yeah, and I do think that that's in some ways the whole that is the umbrella for, so to speak, is like the difference between this kind of postmodern view of there is no truth and that the only thing that's important is who's telling the story.
We
And
can call it strong positionality.
yeah, and a kind of a desire for an objective knowledge, objective truth, um, a field of study to find out what I would say was what really happened. And I think science is the search for the truth. You may never get to it, right? You may always be like, I think I'm there, but then it falls apart. But that is what we're trying to do is really explain it. Not, I want to know what that child's life was 5,000 years ago. What it really was like. I don't want to say, well, it must have been like mine because this is how I feel, or that there is no way of knowing how that child's life was like. I want to know what it was like. And I think that we can figure those things out if we use science.
You want to know what it was like in some sense on its own terms.
Yes.
not on the terms that we want to impose on it, or to take it and make that skeletal child a warrior in a current army or a campaign.
Right. Right.
I want to ask you. We're reaching the end of our conversation, at least the recorded part of the
Yes.
conversation. um, just say a word about your future plans. You have a new book. You're working on a
Yes.
book.
Yes. Well, it is written. It'll come out mid-July from Academica Press. Academica Press, for those who don't know, is the publisher that rescued Jim Flynn's book, and Jim Flynn is a psychologist um, who passed away fairly recently, who wrote on who's who found the Flynn effect, which is a rise in IQ over time. But his last book was about cancel culture, and I think it's called something like "A Book Too Dangerous to Publish." And then his publisher bailed, and Academic Press saved it.
Wow,
So,
wow.
and my book is coming out in mid July. Is called "On the Warpath: My Battles with Indians, Pretendians, and Woke Warriors."
And we're looking forward to that, of
Great.
course. And you also have a STEM grant from
I
HXA.
do. I have a STEM grant from Heterodox looking at how protocols to access skeletal remains has changed both in universities and in museums, and how this then shapes the research.
Nice. And let's just conclude by a couple questions I want to ask you about um, how anthropology can be reformed. Do you have any thoughts about that you want to share? And do you? I mean,
Yeah.
one thing I think I'm hearing from you, that I've heard from other guests too, is that the central lines of conflict are not so much between registered Democrats and registered Republicans, with the Republicans, let's say, being canceled by the Democrats. I'm not going to ask your political affiliation, that I can probably guess, but I'm not going. I won't. I'm not. Nor will I guess. There seems to be a different divide. There's a divide between, you said postmodern before, a divide between people who have certain views about whether the inquiry should happen and meet us where it may, or whether we should be thinking about the world in terms of oppressed versus oppressors. Is that how you see it?
Yes, that's how I see it.
And that people often say that just generally, but I wanna invite you just to say something about anthropology, if you can. Is there something unique about anthropology?
Eh,
Is it a strong instance of this?
I
W
think it is. I think it is.
Why I'm really, what I really wanna ask you is, I'm sorry to interrupt. What I really wanna ask you is, your story seems so incredibly important to me, and I'm trying to understand why it's important. Can you say something about why this thing that's happened in anthropology, with you at the very center of it, why is that important? How does that help us understand what's going on more broadly across the academy and society too, if you like?
Well, I think that anthropology is an incredibly important field from the perspective of one, so many people take anthropology classes, but it's also a field that when you tell people that you're an anthropologist, their eyes light up. And they all like when they've taken a class, they'll remember it, but they'll talk about, what they've seen or read, or, whether it's something like the Neanderthals or the Egyptian mummies. And it's this kind of unifying field in the sense that we all kind of want to know what happened in the past, in the prehistoric past, before we have written records. And that unites us looking for common humanity. Um, you know, it's wondrous. And I think that that's one of the things that is why anthropology is so important, is because it is such a fantastic field. And it's sad that there's this kind of movement to really take away the wonder of anthropology and replace it with modern presentism and identity politics. Um, I hope that the next cohort of anthropology students will be able to see how wonderful the field really is. And like when I was teaching, one of the things I really like to do is to use a lot of images. I think that that's another aspect that anthropology so excelled at, is bringing those past people and the past cultures to life by using images of artifacts, images of skeletal remains, and images of mummies. Um, and then, and you know, several years before this happened, I was teaching a class on mummies. It's called Mummies, and the then provost come to my class, and we were talking about the mummies in Italy, Italian mummies, like of the 15 to 1700s AD. And I was showing them mummy pictures, and then I would go to like the pictures of disease and you know that are found in the mummies and so forth. And it was a really great class. And this provost, he contacted me, you know, even a year later, and he's like, I can't, I'm still thinking about your class. Because basically, it's this kind of uh, humanizing the past and bringing it to life. And that's why I think anthropology is so important. But it spills into forensics, helping, you know, th- crime victims. It spills into medicine. One of the things that I've done multiple times is publish in medical journals. And it's just a field that unites all sorts of areas of knowledge.
Two words that you've said that really just jumped out at me describing anthropology. You described it as wondrous and also as unifying. And I think that's a really, maybe we should close it with
Yes.
with those ideas of yours. So, um, Elizabeth, thank you so much for being Heterodox Out Loud. Thank you for being a fellow here with us at the first year of the Segal Center for Academic Pluralism. It's really been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. Heterodox Out Loud is a nonprofit production of Heterodox Academy. We rely solely on support of listeners like you. If you enjoyed today's episode, please follow our podcast, leave a rating or a review, and share it with your friends and network. Your support helps us reach more individuals who value diverse perspectives in higher education. If you are in higher education, visit heterodoxacademy.org and join the thousands of professors and students from all around the world who are working to support open inquiry. Until next time, I'm John Tomasi, reminding you that great minds don't always think alike.